Tonight, let us explore the shadowy corridors of power where one man operates with authority that answers to no one. Imagine a vow so absolute, it binds a person to have no will but that of the order, even if it means infiltrating enemy lands or destroying the Church's foes. This isn't fiction, it's the oath that forged the Jesuit order, creating a silent machine that shaped history from behind the scenes. How did this promise become the backbone of a global influence network? What if your will became property of an organization, leaving you as motionless as a corpse before command? The Jesuit order required a final oath of extraordinary fidelity, binding members to the order's will above all else. This vow included phrases like entering cursed lands or destroying enemies by any means necessary, creating a psychological break from individual identity. The Latin phrase "perinde acc cadaver" meant to obey superiors as a lifeless body, eliminating personal resistance or hesitation. This training created a global identity where Jesuits across continents could act in concert without public coordination. Modern studies suggest such extreme obedience protocols can reshape human behavior patterns fundamentally. The effect was a silent, precise machine that altered events through moved people and ideas rather than marching armies. Consider how this level of commitment differs from typical religious vows or military pledges. Most religious orders require obedience, but few demand the complete surrender of personal judgment found in the Jesuit formula. Military obedience operates within a chain of command, but allows for situational discretion. The Jesuit vow eliminated that discretion entirely, creating operatives who would execute commands without question across cultural and geographical boundaries. This psychological conditioning involved years of preparation before taking the final oath. Candidates underwent rigorous training in discernment and decision-making, only to surrender that very capacity at the moment of final commitment. The paradox was intentional. They trained men to think critically, so they would better understand why they should not question orders. This created agents who could operate independently while remaining absolutely loyal to the central command structure. The obedience extended beyond physical actions to include intellectual submission. Jesuits pledged to believe that white was black if the Church declared it so, creating a framework where perception itself could be reconfigured by authority. This mental flexibility allowed them to adapt to diverse cultures while maintaining core loyalty, becoming what one observer called chameleons of faith, who could blend into any environment while serving a single master. Historical accounts describe how this training produced remarkable consistency across the global order. A Jesuit in China would interpret local customs using the same theological framework as a colleague in Peru, creating a unified approach to cultural engagement. This shared mental architecture enabled coordination without constant communication, as each member operated from the same set of principles and priorities. The vow's power lay in its transformation of voluntary commitment into involuntary response. Through repetition and reinforcement, obedience became instinctual rather than conscious, creating what modern psychology might call a conditioned reflex. This made disobedience psychologically painful and loyalty emotionally rewarding, ensuring compliance even when supervision was impossible. This oath became the secret weapon that allowed unified action across cultures and centuries. Now, let's examine where this power became centralized in a single shadowy figure. While the world watches the Pope bless crowds from St. Peter's balcony, another figure operates from a modest office nearby, directing the global machinery of the Jesuit order. This man, the Superior General, works from the Curia General just beyond Vatican walls, coordinating missions with authority that purportedly answers to no earthly power. His residence and headquarters stand adjacent to, but separate from the papal apartments, maintaining both physical and operational distance from the public-facing Vatican administration. This figure has earned the nickname Black Pope throughout history, not for any dark purpose, but for the black cassock he wears and the shadowy nature of his influence. He shapes Vatican policy through quiet channels rather than public pronouncements, operating through a network that extends across every continent. The Curia General functions as a strategic nerve center, where intelligence from missions worldwide gets processed and analyzed. Daily reports flow in from Jesuit institutions in over 100 countries, creating a real-time picture of global conditions. The structure creates a parallel system of authority within the Church's visible hierarchy. While the Pope serves as spiritual leader to billions, the Superior General commands an organization with its own priorities and methods. Historical accounts describe how these two centers of power sometimes cooperate and occasionally conflict, with the Jesuit leadership often pursuing long-term strategies that transcend any single papacy. The relationship resembles that of a permanent civil service, working with an elected administration. One provides continuity while the other offers public leadership. Imagine receiving daily briefings from agents in royal courts, academic institutions, and government ministries across the world. The superior general maintains this flow of information through a system developed over centuries, allowing him to identify patterns and opportunities invisible to conventional diplomats. His decisions affect educational policies, humanitarian projects, and religious interventions from remote villages to capital cities. This operational capacity exists without the burden of public visibility or ceremonial responsibilities. The position carries life tenure. Unlike the papacy, which ends with death or resignation, this longevity allows for strategic planning across decades rather than years, creating continuity that outlasts political regimes and papal reigns. Each superior general builds upon the work of his predecessors, maintaining institutional memory through meticulous archives and oral traditions passed down within the order. The system ensures that knowledge gained through centuries of global engagement never gets lost through leadership transitions. This hidden authority demonstrates how real influence often operates behind visible power structures. While cameras focus on papal audiences and Vatican ceremonies, the quieter work of shaping global Catholic strategy continues uninterrupted. The arrangement allows the Church to maintain both a public spiritual leader and an operational commander, each serving different functions within the same institution. We understand how the Black Pope's authority complements the Pope's public power through this division of roles. Meanwhile, this system required embedding agents where power actually resided. How does an organization without armies conquer nations? By placing advisors closer to power than anyone else. Jesuits became spiritual advisors, royal tutors, and confessors in courts across France, Spain, and Portugal, embedding themselves where decisions were made before the public ever learned of them. These positions allowed them to mold policy and diplomacy quietly, while maintaining plausible deniability, operating through suggestion rather than command. They became ghost advisors who could whisper recommendations that would later emerge as royal decrees, their influence woven into the fabric of governance without leaving visible fingerprints. This access enabled them to shape entire generations of leadership through education and spiritual guidance. Jesuit tutors taught royal children not merely mathematics and languages, but ways of thinking about power, responsibility, and the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. The formation began in childhood and continued through adolescence, creating rulers who had been mentored by the same order for their entire lives. The education emphasized discernment and decision-making within a framework that aligned with Jesuit priorities, ensuring that when these students assumed power, they would naturally consult their former teachers on matters of state. Historical records show Jesuit confessors hearing the most sensitive secrets of state while bound by vows of silence. Kings and ministers would reveal their political worries, military plans, and personal struggles in the confidentiality of the confessional, providing intelligence that flowed back to the order's leadership. The confessor's role created a unique position of trust where spiritual counsel could subtly guide political decisions under the guise of moral guidance. This channel of influence operated outside normal diplomatic circuits, allowing the order to anticipate political developments and position itself advantageously. The strategy was explicit, influenced the source of power rather than challenging it directly. Jesuits understood that controlling the person who made decisions was more effective than controlling the institutions through which those decisions were formalized. They positioned themselves as indispensable counselors who offered not only spiritual comfort, but practical wisdom on governance, economics, and international relations. Their advice carried the weight of both religious authority and perceived neutrality, making rulers more receptive to their guidance than to that of competing court factions. Consider how much influence you could wield by being the last voice a ruler hears before making decisions. The Jesuit confessor or advisor often had final access to the monarch before important meetings or judgments, allowing them to frame issues in specific ways or suggest particular courses of action. This privileged position meant that even when other advisors had presented conflicting views, The Jesuit perspective could become the final filter through which all options were evaluated. The cumulative effect of these interventions shaped policies on religious tolerance, foreign alliances, and domestic reforms across multiple kingdoms. This embedding in centers of power created lasting influence that outlived political regimes and monarchies. Even when individual rulers fell from power or dynasties changed, the Jesuit presence often continued because their role was perceived as apolitical and spiritual rather than partisan. Their network of schools and churches provided continuous access to emerging elites, ensuring that each new generation of leaders would have similar formation and connections. The strategy created a durable infrastructure that operated across political transitions, maintaining continuity where governments faced instability. Next, let's explore how they built entire societies from scratch when court access wasn't possible. What happens when a religious order decides to build its own societies, completely separate from existing powers? In Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, Jesuits established self-contained communities called reductions, creating parallel worlds that operated beyond the reach of colonial governors and royal decrees. These settlements blended faith, education, and administration under tight Jesuit governance, reorganizing indigenous life according to a blueprint developed in Rome and adapted for the South American frontier. The system gathered native populations into planned towns where every aspect of life, from worship to work to family structure, fell under Jesuit supervision. These communities flourished with sophisticated economic systems that operated independently of colonial authorities. Jesuit managers directed agricultural production, ran workshops for crafts and manufacturing, and established trade networks that extended across South America and across the Atlantic. They produced textiles, leather goods, and agricultural products that competed directly with Spanish and Portuguese merchants, creating economic friction with colonial powers. The reducciones controlled their own finances, maintained their own militias for defense, and negotiated directly with colonial officials as semi-autonomous entities. They represented a deliberate social model that masked economic and political power in the name of salvation. The stated purpose was converting and protecting indigenous populations, but the practical effect was creating territorial enclaves where Jesuit authority replaced that of kings and viceroys. The communities developed their own legal systems, educational programs, and economic policies, all administered by Jesuit priests who answered to their superior general rather than local bishops or colonial administrators. This arrangement allowed the order to test social theories and governance models on a scale unmatched by any other religious organization. These communities became so successful that they threatened European powers' control over colonial economies. By the early 18th century, the reducciones had become economic powerhouses with vast landholdings, skilled labor forces, and international trading connections. Their economic independence challenged the mercantilist systems that European empires imposed on their colonies, creating tension between Jesuit ambitions and imperial priorities. Spanish and Portuguese officials grew increasingly concerned about these semi-independent states operating within their territories but outside their control. Historical accounts describe these settlements as utopian experiments with unprecedented autonomy. Visitors reported well-organized towns with clean streets, efficient production facilities, and educated populations that contrasted sharply with conditions in colonial territories. The reducciones maintained libraries, hospitals, and music schools while developing agricultural techniques that surpassed European methods. Their success demonstrated what could be achieved when a single organization controlled all aspects of community life without external interference. Imagine building entire societies that answer to a religious order rather than kings or emperors. The Jesuit superiors in each reduction made decisions about land use, resource allocation, and social organization that would normally fall to civil authorities. They created systems where spiritual authority and temporal power merged completely, with priests serving as both religious leaders and civil administrators. This experiment in theocratic governance showed how religious orders could establish functional states when given the opportunity to implement their vision without compromise. This reveals what happened when Jesuits built their own societies, autonomous communities that ultimately threatened empires by demonstrating alternative models of governance and economic organization. The reducciones proved that a religious order could create stable, prosperous societies outside conventional political structures. challenging the assumption that only monarchies or colonial administrations could govern effectively. Their very success made them targets for empires that couldn't tolerate competing power centers within their domains. Now, let's examine why European powers eventually expelled them from colonies. When your shadow empire becomes too successful, even kings will notice and act against you. By the mid-18th century, Jesuit power in the Americas had grown substantial enough to threaten European crowns through its independent economic networks, autonomous communities, and influence over colonial administration. The Reductians, in particular, represented a challenge to imperial authority, operating as semi-independent states within Spanish and Portuguese territories while maintaining loyalty to a religious superior in Rome rather than to the monarchs who nominally ruled these colonies. Pressure from European powers culminated in the 1767 expulsion of Jesuits from Spanish colonies, dismantling their formal structures across Central and South America. Spanish officials arrived at reduction settlements, with royal orders authorizing immediate seizure of properties and expulsion of all Jesuit personnel. Soldiers escorted priests from their missions, often giving them minimal time to gather personal belongings before marching them to coastal ports for deportation to Europe. The same pattern repeated across Spanish territories from California to Argentina, effectively ending nearly 2 centuries of Jesuit presence in the Americas. The expulsion orders specifically targeted Jesuit wealth and influence rather than their religious activities. Colonial authorities inventoried and confiscated libraries, agricultural lands, workshops, and financial assets that the order had accumulated through its economic activities. Royal officials focused particularly on seizing control of the lucrative trade networks that the Reductions had developed, integrating them into the crown's mercantile system. The removal was systematic and comprehensive, designed to eliminate Jesuit economic competition and political influence while maintaining the Catholic presence through other religious orders. European monarchs feared the order's loyalty to the superior general above their temporal authority. The very structure that made Jesuits effective, their global coordination and obedience to a single leader, became their greatest liability. When that loyalty appeared to conflict with national interests, kings saw Jesuit priests as potential fifth columns who might prioritize the order's agenda over the crown's commands, especially in colonial territories where communication with Europe was slow and unreliable. This fear of divided loyalty provided the justification for expulsion, even when Jesuits had demonstrated clear contributions to colonial development. This period represented the greatest crisis in Jesuit history, with members exiled and properties confiscated across multiple empires. Expelled Jesuits faced uncertain futures as they arrived in European ports without their communities, resources, or established networks. Many found temporary refuge in papal states, while others dispersed to regions where the order still maintained some presence. The suppression tested the very foundation of their identity, forcing them to maintain cohesion without the institutional structures that had defined their work for generations. Yet historical accounts suggest they preserved knowledge, archives, and networks during this suppression. Exiled Jesuits managed to conceal or duplicate important documents before authorities could seize them, preserving records of their missions, economic systems, and scientific observations. They maintained communication through personal letters and trusted intermediaries, creating a shadow network that operated beneath official notice. This underground preservation effort allowed the order to rebuild when opportunities eventually emerged, demonstrating remarkable organizational resilience. Consider how an organization survives when physically removed from its power bases and resources. The Jesuits maintained their identity through shared formation, common practices, and continuing obedience to their superiors, even when those superiors could no longer provide material support. They adapted their mission to new circumstances, with some members continuing educational work as private tutors, while others engaged in scholarly research that maintained the order's intellectual traditions. This flexibility allowed them to endure for decades of official suppression without losing their core identity or purpose. The expulsion demonstrated that ideas and institutions can outlast emperors and physical presence. The very kings who ordered the suppression eventually died and were replaced, while the Jesuit educational methods, organizational principles, and spiritual practices continued through their dispersed members. This resilience showed that real power resides not in buildings or territories, but in shared beliefs and practices that can be carried across borders and through generations. The order's survival despite losing everything revealed the durability of its foundational ideas. Meanwhile, in Asia, they developed a completely different approach to influence. How do you influence a civilization that doesn't want your religion? You become valuable in other ways. In China, Jesuit missionaries adopted a revolutionary approach by mastering Mandarin, wearing scholars' robes, and integrating Western astronomy with Chinese calendar systems. This method of cultural adaptation rather than confrontation created a template for cross-cultural engagement that prioritized mutual respect over conversion pressure. They established their presence not through churches but through observatories and scholarly discussions, positioning themselves as bearers of valuable knowledge rather than just religious doctrine. This strategy involved careful study of Confucian classics and Chinese administrative systems, allowing Jesuits to present Christianity as compatible with local philosophical traditions. They translated Euclidean geometry into Chinese while composing poetry in classical forms, demonstrating respect for the host culture while introducing new ideas. Their astronomical calculations proved more accurate than those of imperial astronomers, earning them positions within the Ming and Qing court administrations. This technical contribution provided the entry point for broader cultural exchange that lasted centuries. They influenced through science, philosophy, and shared projects rather than mere proselytizing. Jesuit scholars worked alongside Chinese intellectuals on cartography, calendar reform, and mathematical treatises, creating collaborations that transcended religious differences. Their Beijing Observatory became a center for scientific exchange where mandarins and missionaries debated astronomy, geography, and technology. This approach built relationships based on intellectual curiosity rather than religious agreement, creating lasting influence even among officials who never converted to Christianity. In Japan, early missions established through similar cultural engagement gave way to suppression, yet Jesuit presence lingered in intellectual circles long after official expulsion. Missionaries had initially gained influence by introducing Western medicine, painting techniques, and musical instruments to feudal lords, even after the Tokugawa shogunate banned Christianity and expelled foreign priests. European scientific knowledge and artistic methods continued circulating through Japanese scholarly networks. Jesuit-educated translators and interpreters maintained cross-cultural connections despite the official prohibition on their religious activities. This strategy left a lasting imprint on Asian science and religious thought without military conquest. The Chinese calendar incorporated Jesuit astronomical corrections for nearly 2 centuries, while Japanese maps reflected geographic knowledge brought by missionaries. Confucian scholars engaged with Christian theology through texts translated by Jesuits, creating unique syncretic philosophies that blended Eastern and Western thought. The cultural exchange initiated by these missions influenced Asian intellectual development in ways that persisted long after the missionaries themselves were forgotten. The superior general in Europe received continuous intelligence on Asian courts from these missions, creating an unprecedented flow of information about Eastern civilizations. Detailed reports describing Chinese governance, Japanese social structures, and regional politics reached Rome regularly, giving Jesuit leadership sophisticated understanding of Asian affairs. This intelligence network operated through commercial channels and diplomatic exchanges, with merchants and officials carrying letters between continents. The information helped shape European perceptions of Asia while guiding Jesuit strategy across different cultural contexts. Imagine gaining influence by first proving your value through knowledge and cultural respect. The Jesuit approach required patience, spending years learning languages and customs before attempting any religious discussion. This slow process built trust and demonstrated genuine interest in the host culture, rather than merely using it as a conversion target. Missionaries became valued advisors because they offered practical solutions to real problems, whether improving calendar accuracy or designing better irrigation systems. Their influence grew from demonstrated competence rather than doctrinal persuasion. This cultural adaptation strategy showed how influence could flow through respect rather than force. By honoring local traditions while offering valuable knowledge, Jesuits gained access to powerful circles that would have rejected outright missionary activity. Their success demonstrated that cultural sensitivity could achieve what military power or doctrinal rigidity could not: lasting intellectual impact that transformed how societies understood themselves and their place in the world. The approach created channels of influence that operated through admiration rather than fear. through shared inquiry rather than imposed belief. Next, let's examine how they maintained influence even during their suppression period. When an organization goes underground for 40 years, how does it maintain its global network? The 1773 suppression by Pope Clement XIV formally abolished the Jesuit order worldwide, dissolving its institutions and dispersing its members across Europe and beyond. This papal decree should have erased the Jesuits from history, ending nearly 2.5 centuries of organized activity. Yet despite this official dissolution, Jesuit networks and knowledge preservation continued operating through informal channels and personal relationships that survived the formal structure's collapse. Exiled Jesuits integrated into various intellectual circles and institutions, while maintaining connections through coded correspondence and trusted intermediaries. Many found positions as tutors, librarians, or scholars in noble households and universities, carrying their educational methods into new settings. They preserved their pedagogical approaches through private teaching and manuscript circulation, ensuring that the Jesuit model of education would survive even without official schools. These dispersed members maintained contact through letters that used careful language to discuss ongoing projects and shared interests without explicitly referencing the band organization. They preserved their educational methods and strategic thinking through informal networks and archives hidden in private collections and religious houses sympathetic to their cause. Former Jesuits compiled manuscripts detailing their teaching techniques, administrative systems, and mission strategies, safeguarding this knowledge for future restoration. These documents contained everything from classroom exercises to diplomatic correspondence, creating a complete record of how the order had operated across continents. The preservation effort required meticulous organization and absolute discretion, with materials stored in multiple locations to prevent total loss through discovery. Historical accounts suggest they continued influencing events through former students and sympathizers who occupied positions of power in governments, universities, and royal courts. Their educational legacy meant that generations of European elites had been taught by Jesuits and maintained relationships with their former instructors. These connections created channels of influence that operated through personal loyalty rather than organizational affiliation. Former students might consult their old teachers on matters of policy or education, maintaining the flow of ideas despite the official suppression. This period tested their resilience and demonstrated the durability of their organizational model under extreme pressure. The suppression forced Jesuits to adapt their operations to completely new circumstances, maintaining cohesion without the institutional framework that had defined their existence. They developed new communication methods, trust networks, and preservation strategies that would later serve them when restoration became possible. The experience proved that their strength lay in shared formation and common purpose, rather than legal status or physical institutions. Consider how an idea survives when its formal structure is officially dismantled by the highest authority. The Jesuit case shows that organizations can persist through personal relationships, educational influence, and archival preservation even when every official channel has been closed. Their survival depended on the deep formation that had taught members to think and act according to shared principles regardless of external circumstances. This internal coherence allowed them to maintain identity and purpose across decades of dispersion and uncertainty. The suppression era proved that their power resided in education and networks rather than formal status. What mattered wasn't the official recognition, but the relationships they had built, the minds they had shaped, and the knowledge they had preserved. This demonstrated that real influence often operates through informal channels that are harder to identify and eliminate than formal structures. The Jesuits emerged from suppression with their educational methods intact and their network of relationships largely preserved, ready to rebuild when the political climate changed. Now, let's explore their mysterious relationship with another secretive organization. What happens when two secretive power structures encounter each other? The historical record becomes curiously blurred between the Jesuit order and Freemasonry, particularly during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Catholic Church officially condemned Freemasonry as heretical and atheistic through multiple papal decrees, creating an apparent ideological chasm between the two organizations. Yet whispers persisted about possible overlaps in personnel and interests during this period of significant societal upheaval across Europe and the Americas. Some scholars propose that exiled Jesuits, expelled from various countries during suppression periods, integrated into Masonic lodges and brought organizational discipline with them. These former priests might have contributed their administrative skills and strategic thinking to Masonic operations during a time when both groups faced opposition from established powers. The late 18th century presented unique circumstances where traditional institutions were weakening, creating opportunities for alternative networks to gain influence through covert means. Both organizations shared striking similarities in their operational methods despite their different stated purposes. They maintained secret rituals, hierarchical structures, coded communication systems, and demanded absolute loyalty from members. Their global networks operated through local chapters that maintained consistency while adapting to regional conditions. This structural parallelism suggests either shared organizational principles or possible cross-pollination between the two systems during their formative periods. Historical accounts describe them as potential arms of a broader influence system that sometimes worked in tandem despite surface differences. In post-revolutionary France, where churches faced destruction and clergy encountered hostility, Jesuits reappeared within intellectual circles that were heavily influenced by Masonic ideology. Indirect evidence suggests Jesuit advisors participated in secret society projects related to education and social reform, operating within Masonic-influenced networks while maintaining their own purposes. The relationship remains paradoxical because official positions suggested absolute opposition while practical circumstances created potential collaboration. Freemasonry's emphasis on reason, science, and humanism stood in contrast to the Jesuit focus on faith and religious obedience. Yet both groups understood power dynamics and the value of operating through selective membership and discrete communication channels. This shared operational wisdom might have created unofficial channels of exchange despite public condemnations. Imagine the strategic advantage of maintaining influence within an organization your institution publicly condemns. Such an arrangement would allow access to information and networks, while maintaining plausible deniability through official opposition. The complex relationship demonstrates how power networks can operate across apparent ideological boundaries when practical interests align. Organizations with different stated goals might find common ground in methods and operational needs, despite surface differences in philosophy. The silence from both organizations regarding their historical relationship speaks volumes through absence rather than declaration. Neither group has offered comprehensive documentation or clear statements about their interactions during this turbulent period. This mutual discretion reflects their shared preference for operating behind closed doors, rather than through public pronouncements. The lack of definitive evidence has fueled speculation while making historical verification challenging for researchers. This paradoxical relationship demonstrates how power networks can operate across apparent ideological boundaries when strategic interests converge. The Jesuit-Masonic connection, whether real or imagined, shows how organizations with different surface purposes might share operational methods and even personnel during periods of societal transformation. The historical ambiguity itself becomes evidence of how influence operates through channels that remain intentionally obscured from public view. Meanwhile, their educational empire was quietly rebuilding their influence globally through more conventional channels. How do you shape future rulers? Start by educating them as children and implanting certain ways of thinking. Jesuits built hundreds of elite schools worldwide, educating not just the faithful, but future ministers, generals, and policymakers. The strategy was explicit: plant Jesuit thought early in the minds of young elites to shape policy later. This educational approach would outlive changes in monarchs and regimes, creating durable influence that transcended political transitions and national boundaries. They established institutions where the children of powerful families received formation that combined intellectual rigor with spiritual discipline, creating leaders who shared common ways of analyzing problems and making decisions. The educational philosophy emphasized discipline, logic, critical thinking, and strategic influence rather than mere information transfer. Students learned to view society as a system that could be understood, shaped, and controlled through careful analysis and deliberate action. The curriculum evolved beyond theology to include social sciences, political thought, modern philosophy, and technology, always embedding Catholic values within humanism and global ethics. This approach created graduates who could operate effectively in government, finance, or academia while maintaining certain shared perspectives and priorities. They trained generations to think like strategists, conferring loyalty that stretched beyond religious boundaries. The education created bonds between students and their Jesuit mentors that often lasted throughout their careers, providing channels of influence that operated through personal relationships rather than formal structures. Alumni maintained connections with their teachers and classmates, creating networks that spanned different sectors and countries. This web of relationships allowed the order to maintain influence even when individual members moved into secular positions or changed professions. Historical records show many influential figures studied within Jesuit institutions, though the connection often remains understated in official biographies. The education provided tools for understanding power dynamics and organizational behavior, equipping students to operate effectively within complex systems. The formation emphasized both service and leadership, creating individuals who could adapt to different roles depending on circumstances and opportunities. This flexibility made Jesuit-educated individuals valuable across various sectors, from government to finance to education. This educational network became the engine of their long-term power and global reach, operating through generations of influential alumni. The schools served as continuous points of contact with emerging elites, ensuring that each new generation of leaders would have similar formation and connections. The approach created consistent influence across political changes because the educational foundation remained constant even when governments and policies shifted. This consistency allowed the order to maintain presence and impact through centuries of social transformation. Consider how much influence you gain by teaching the children of powerful families for generations. The relationship begins in childhood, when minds are most receptive to new ideas and ways of thinking. The education shapes not only what students know, but how they think about problems and solutions. This formative influence creates patterns of thought that persist throughout adult life, affecting decisions in boardrooms, government offices, and international organizations. The cumulative effect across generations creates a web of shared perspective that operates beneath the surface of visible power structures. Their educational empire created a global web of influence anchored in formative mind-shaping. The schools functioned as laboratories where educational methods could be refined and adapted to different cultural contexts while maintaining core principles. This network allowed for consistent formation across continents, creating leaders who shared common approaches to problem-solving despite different national backgrounds. The system demonstrated how education could serve as a vehicle for cultural influence that operated through admiration and respect rather than coercion or control. Next, let's examine how this educational network influenced modern intelligence operations through its alumni connections and shared methodologies. When your alumni network includes intelligence directors, you gain access to information beyond normal channels. Many senior figures within intelligence agencies received education at Jesuit institutions, creating informal pathways for collaboration that operated outside official diplomatic circuits. This connection fostered intelligence sharing and ideological alignment during periods of global tension, particularly throughout the Cold War era, when both groups shared concerns about geopolitical stability and ideological expansion. Jesuit networks became embedded within think tanks, universities, and policy circles that influenced development and governance strategies worldwide. Their educational institutions produced graduates who entered government service with shared analytical frameworks and communication styles, creating natural affinity across different organizations. This educational common ground allowed for smoother collaboration between intelligence operatives and Jesuit-affiliated personnel in various regions, particularly where traditional diplomatic channels faced limitations or suspicion. Historical accounts describe Jesuit networks serving as informal envoys during world conflicts, providing ground-level intelligence that complemented official reporting. In conflict zones and politically sensitive regions, Jesuit missionaries and educators often had deeper community connections than foreign diplomats or intelligence officers. Their religious standing provided cover for observation and information gathering that would have been impossible for conventional intelligence operatives. This arrangement created a valuable supplementary intelligence stream that operated through cultural and religious channels rather than official government networks. They maintained a neutral or subtly aligned posture with various powers during turbulent periods, allowing them to operate in regions where overt intelligence activity would have been rejected. This perceived neutrality provided access to communities and leaders who distrusted government officials but respected religious figures. The dual role of spiritual advisor and informal observer created unique opportunities for information collection and influence that complemented traditional intelligence operations. Imagine having former students in key intelligence positions across multiple governments and agencies. The educational connection created bonds that transcended national boundaries and organizational affiliations. Former classmates might share perspectives or information through personal channels that bypassed formal protocols, creating informal networks of trust and collaboration. These relationships often persisted throughout careers, allowing for continuous exchange of insights and assessments across different intelligence communities. This intelligence connection demonstrated how educational networks could shape geopolitical outcomes through soft power channels. The shared formation created common ways of analyzing threats, assessing opportunities, and developing strategies across different organizations. This alignment allowed for more coordinated responses to global challenges. Despite the absence of formal agreements or joint command structures, the influence operated through shared worldview rather than direct instruction, making it more subtle and potentially more durable than official partnerships. The collaboration was particularly evident in regions where ideological conflicts created complex operational environments. Jesuit educational institutions had produced local leaders who understood both Western perspectives and regional realities, creating valuable intermediaries between intelligence agencies and local populations. These individuals could provide cultural translation and contextual understanding that improved the effectiveness of intelligence operations and policy implementations. This informal alignment created a complementary system where religious and intelligence networks supported each other's objectives without requiring official acknowledgement or coordination. The relationship demonstrated how influence can operate through multiple parallel channels that reinforce each other, while maintaining separate identities and purposes. This multifaceted approach allowed for more comprehensive engagement with complex global challenges than any single organization could achieve alone. Meanwhile, their financial influence was growing through equally subtle channels that connected educational networks with economic power centers. How does a religious order influence global finance? By educating the minds that control capital. Jesuit networks developed ties to major banks and financial institutions through their educational system, creating pathways for their graduates to enter elite financial circles. Their universities served as incubators for future central bankers, hedge fund managers, and finance ministers who carried shared perspectives into their professional lives. This educational pipeline created long-term alignment between Jesuit values and financial practices, shaping how economic power was understood and exercised across generations. Prominent figures in finance and central banks carried Jesuit training, creating conceptual frameworks that influenced economic policy and market behavior. These individuals often maintained relationships with their educational roots while rising through financial institutions, creating informal networks of influence that operated alongside formal economic structures. The shared formation created common approaches to risk assessment, ethical considerations, and strategic planning that transcended individual institutions or national boundaries. They used charitable fronts to fund development projects that aligned with economic interests, creating partnerships between religious organizations and financial institutions. These initiatives often focused on poverty reduction, education, and infrastructure development in regions where financial interests sought stability or market access. The collaboration allowed financial entities to pursue strategic objectives under the guise of humanitarian work, while Jesuit organizations gained resources and influence for their missions. This financial dimension linked education, philanthropy, and global capital in subtle but pervasive ways that affected economic development patterns worldwide. The connections operated through personal relationships, shared values, and parallel interests rather than formal agreements or public partnerships. This approach allowed for coordinated action across different sectors while maintaining plausible deniability about the extent of collaboration or shared objectives. Historical accounts suggest Jesuit thinkers shaped the ethical frame around money and development policy. influencing how financial systems understood their social responsibilities. They contributed to discussions about economic justice, fair trade, and sustainable development that informed both corporate practices and regulatory frameworks. Their intellectual influence helped create conceptual bridges between profit motives and social objectives within capitalist systems. Their influence operated as a silent backbone for global economic strategies and institutions, providing moral and intellectual justification for certain financial practices. Jesuit-educated consultants and advisors helped design systems that balanced economic efficiency with ethical considerations, creating frameworks that gained acceptance across different cultural and political contexts. This soft power approach allowed them to shape financial ecosystems without holding formal positions of control. Consider how much power resides in shaping the ethical frameworks that govern financial systems. The definitions of responsible investing, corporate ethics, and economic development priorities all emerge from conceptual frameworks that can be influenced through education and intellectual leadership. By helping define what constitutes ethical financial behavior, Jesuit networks gained influence over how capital moved through global systems and how economic power was exercised. Their financial influence showed how moral authority could quietly steer economic policy through conceptual frameworks, rather than direct control. The approach demonstrated that real power in finance often resides in the ideas that justify certain practices and condemn others, rather than in the mere accumulation of capital. This ideological influence created channels for shaping economic behavior that were more subtle and potentially more durable than regulatory or political interventions. Now, let us examine their role in shaping modern global governance frameworks through similar soft power channels and intellectual leadership. How does a centuries-old organization remain relevant in modern multinational institutions? Jesuit networks became embedded in post-war think tanks, development agencies, and policy circles across every continent, operating through educational institutions and humanitarian organizations rather than traditional religious channels. Their approach prioritizes information, narratives, and public influence over overt coercion, shaping policies through intellectual frameworks rather than direct intervention. This methodology allows them to influence development and governance across diverse regions. While maintaining plausible deniability about their role in shaping outcomes, they helped shape modern concepts of human rights, climate policy, and international development through research, institutions, and advisory roles. Their universities produce studies that inform global policy debates, while their scholars serve on international panels and commissions. This intellectual contribution creates conceptual frameworks that guide how nations approach poverty reduction, environmental protection, and human dignity. The influence operates through accepted expertise rather than religious authority, making it more palatable to secular governments and international organizations. Historical accounts describe them operating through NGOs and academic institutions rather than direct power, representing a significant shift from traditional religious influence to ideological leadership in global governance. The Jesuit Refugee Service exemplifies this modern approach, providing humanitarian aid while gathering intelligence and influencing social structures in conflict zones. Their educational institutions train future diplomats and policymakers who carry these perspectives into international organizations, creating continuity across generations of global leadership. This transformation reflects adaptation to a world where religious authority has diminished, but the need for ethical frameworks persists. By focusing on human rights, sustainable development, and global ethics, Jesuits maintain relevance while avoiding direct confrontation with secular power structures. Their influence now flows through research papers, policy recognitions, and educational programs rather than papal decrees or religious pronouncements, creating a more subtle but equally powerful form of global engagement. Imagine shaping the very frameworks that nations use to relate to each other in the modern era. Jesuit thinkers contribute to the conceptual vocabulary of international relations, helping define terms like common good, integral ecology, and ethical globalization. These concepts then circulate through diplomatic channels, academic conferences, and policy documents, gradually becoming accepted as standard references in global discourse. The process demonstrates how ideas originating within religious traditions can influence secular governance through intellectual rather than doctrinal channels. Their modern influence demonstrates how religious values inform global policy through soft power channels that emphasize persuasion over compulsion. This approach allows them to maintain impact despite the declining influence of organized religion in many societies. By operating through respected institutions and focusing on universally acceptable goals like human development and environmental protection, they continue shaping global affairs while avoiding the resistance that direct religious intervention might provoke. The strategy represents a sophisticated understanding of how power operates in the information age. Influence increasingly resides in controlling the frameworks through which problems are defined and solutions are evaluated, rather than in commanding armies or controlling territories. Jesuit networks have adapted to this reality by positioning themselves as sources of wisdom on complex global challenges, offering guidance that blends ethical considerations with practical expertise. Their continued relevance shows how organizations can evolve while maintaining core principles. The methods have changed from royal confessors to policy advisors, from mission schools to elite universities, from agricultural communes to development NGOs, but the underlying purpose remains, influencing how societies are organized and how power is exercised, demonstrating remarkable continuity across centuries of global transformation. This modern incarnation of their influence operates through multiple parallel channels that reinforce each other, while maintaining separate identities. Educational institutions produce research that informs policy. Humanitarian organizations implement programs that demonstrate effectiveness. And diplomatic engagement builds relationships that facilitate cooperation. This multifaceted approach creates a comprehensive system of influence that is both effective and difficult to trace to its origins. Their modern influence demonstrates how religious values inform global policy through soft power channels that shape how nations understand their responsibilities and opportunities in an interconnected world. Next, let's meet the current Black Pope and understand his role today, who operates today as the hidden architect of Vatican policy and the global order. Arturo Sosa Abascal became the 31st Superior General in 2016. The contemporary figure who continues the centuries-old tradition of Jesuit leadership. His Venezuelan origins and political science background provide him with unique insights into both Latin American dynamics and global power structures, creating a bridge between regional experience and worldwide influence. Fluent in multiple languages, he navigates international dialogues with the ease that reflects the Jesuit tradition of cross-cultural engagement. His expertise spans politics, economics, development, and climate justice, and usually broad for a religious leader. This comprehensive understanding allows him to address complex global challenges through integrated approaches that connect environmental concerns with economic justice and political stability. His academic background includes teaching at prestigious universities, providing him with both theoretical knowledge and practical experience in shaping young minds that will later occupy positions of influence across various sectors. He operates as a diplomat who speaks less in public but influences through Jesuit institutions worldwide. His leadership manifests through education, humanitarian work, and think tank engagement across continents, creating a web of influence that operates through respected channels rather than overt power demonstrations. This approach allows him to shape discussions and policies while maintaining the low profile that has characterized Jesuit leadership throughout history. Historical patterns suggest he continues the centuries-long project of shaping minds and institutions from behind scenes. The educational network under his guidance produces leaders who carry forward Jesuit principles in government, finance, and academia, creating continuity across generations of global influence. This long-term strategy demonstrates how patient cultivation of intellectual and ethical frameworks can create lasting impact beyond immediate political cycles. He represents the modern incarnation of a leadership style that prefers subtle influence over public recognition. His approach focuses on building consensus and shaping paradigms, rather than issuing commands or seeking visibility. This method allows the order to maintain relevance in a world where direct religious authority has diminished, but the need for ethical guidance persists across global challenges. Consider leading a global network while remaining largely unknown to the general public. The Superior General oversees thousands of educational institutions, humanitarian organizations, and research centers across more than 100 countries. Yet his name rarely appears in mainstream media. This anonymity reflects a strategic choice to operate through established systems rather than personal celebrity, creating influence that is distributed and therefore more resilient to political changes or public scrutiny. His leadership continues the Jesuit tradition of adapting methods while maintaining core principles. The focus on education, intellectual engagement, and ethical framework building remains constant, but the applications evolve to address contemporary issues like climate change, migration, and economic inequality. This flexibility allows the order to maintain relevance across centuries of social transformation while staying true to its foundational purpose. Sosa embodies the continuing relevance of the Black Pope concept in modern global affairs through his operational approach rather than theatrical power displays. His influence flows through respected channels that include university research, policy development, and diplomatic engagement, creating impact that is both substantial and difficult to quantify. This demonstrates how power can operate effectively without the traditional trappings of authority or public recognition. The position maintains its distinctive character through life, tenure, and global oversight responsibilities, allowing for long-term strategic planning that transcends political cycles. This continuity creates stability in an organization that must navigate rapidly changing global conditions while maintaining its core identity and purpose. The arrangement demonstrates how institutions can preserve their essential character while adapting to new challenges and opportunities. Meanwhile, a Jesuit finally ascended to the visible throne of papal power, creating a unique convergence of historical patterns and contemporary realities. What happens when the hidden power structure suddenly gets a visible leader? Pope Francis became the first Jesuit pope, representing a climactic moment in the order's strategic arc. This conversion of a Jesuit priest into the White Throne leader legitimized and magnified Jesuit influence in ways that previous papacies had not achieved. His election signaled a shift where the careful cultivation of minds and institutions over centuries finally manifested in the highest office of the Catholic Church, creating a unique convergence of historical preparation and contemporary opportunity. His papacy created tension between visible leadership and the hidden power structure that continues steering policy. While the world watches the Pope address global issues, the Jesuit network maintains its educational and diplomatic operations through established channels. This arrangement creates a dynamic where public pronouncements from the Vatican can align with quieter efforts happening through Jesuit universities, think tanks, and humanitarian organizations worldwide. The relationship demonstrates how overt and covert influence can operate in tandem rather than in conflict. Historical patterns suggest the Black Pope's reach remains intact. Despite this visible Jesuit leadership, the Superior General continues, coordinating the global network that extends across education, policy, and humanitarian work, maintaining the operational capacity that has characterized Jesuit influence for centuries. This continuity ensures that regardless of who occupies the papal office, the order's long-term strategies and institutional priorities continue advancing through their established channels and relationships. This arrangement represents the modern manifestation of political religion, where faith values inform global policy through multiple parallel channels. The papacy provides moral authority and public visibility, while the Jesuit network offers implementation, capacity, and intellectual resources. Together they create a comprehensive system for influencing how societies address poverty, migration, environmental concerns, and international relations, blending spiritual guidance with practical engagement. The papacy coexists with the unseen influence network that operates through education and soft power, creating a dual approach to global engagement. On one level, there are papal encyclicals and public addresses that shape international discourse. Simultaneously, there are classroom discussions, policy research, and diplomatic conversations happening through Jesuit institutions that translate these broad principles into concrete actions and strategies. This multi-layered approach allows for both proclamation and implementation. Imagine having your organizational member become the most visible religious leader while maintaining shadow operations through your established network. The situation creates unprecedented opportunities for alignment between public statements and private actions, between moral authority and practical influence. The Jesuit educational system that formed this pope continues forming future leaders who will carry these integrated perspectives into governments, financial institutions, and international organizations worldwide. The relationship between the Jesuit Pope and the Jesuit Superior General represents a unique configuration in church history. While maintaining proper ecclesiastical boundaries, they share formation experiences, organizational values, and strategic perspectives that create natural alignment despite their different roles. This common background facilitates coordination that might be more challenging between leaders from different religious traditions or educational backgrounds. Francis' papacy demonstrates how visible leadership can coexist with and amplify hidden influence networks rather than replacing them. The public platform of the papacy gives greater reach to ideas and approaches that have been developing within Jesuit circles for generations, while the Jesuit network provides implementation capacity that extends beyond what the Vatican bureaucracy can achieve alone. This combination creates a powerful synergy between symbolic authority and operational capability. The arrangement shows how organizations can maintain their essential character while adapting to new opportunities and challenges. The Jesuit approach has always emphasized flexibility and strategic thinking, and having one of their members become pope represents both an unexpected development and a validation of their long-term methods. The situation demonstrates how patience and consistent effort can eventually create opportunities that transform the relationship between background influence and public authority. Now, let's examine why this history remains conspicuously absent from mainstream education and public discourse about power structures. Why don't textbooks mention the architectural power behind many historical events? Jesuit influence remains conspicuously absent from standard history syllabi and educational materials, creating a curious gap in our understanding of how power actually operates across centuries. This omission suggests a deliberate attempt to obscure certain power dynamics from public view, preventing comprehensive awareness of how influence networks shape world events behind visible political structures. The pattern persists across different educational systems and historical periods, suggesting something more systematic than mere oversight. Many dictators, financiers, and political leaders studied within Jesuit institutions without these connections being highlighted in mainstream historical narratives. Their educational background becomes a footnote rather than a central feature of their biographical accounts. Despite the formative influence this education likely exerted on their thinking and decision-making patterns, the consistent downplaying of these educational relationships prevents viewers from recognizing the patterns that connect seemingly disparate historical figures through shared formation and philosophical grounding. Their role in intelligence gathering, banking operations, and secret diplomacy remains significantly underdocumented in conventional historical accounts. Textbooks might mention Jesuit missionaries or educators, but rarely explore their function as intelligence gatherers, policy influencers, or financial network operators. This selective presentation creates an incomplete picture that emphasizes religious aspects while minimizing political and economic dimensions, effectively hiding the full scope of their historical impact. During colonial periods, educational materials often describe Jesuit activities in faith-based terms while overlooking their involvement in cartography, strategic negotiations, and intelligence collection. The narrative focuses on conversion efforts rather than the systematic gathering of geographical knowledge, cultural intelligence, and political information that supported colonial expansion and administration. This narrowed perspective prevents understanding how religious and political objectives intertwined during imperial projects. Even in discussions of scientific progress, mainstream history frequently neglects to mention how many influential thinkers and scientists received formation within Jesuit educational frameworks. The contribution of Jesuit-trained intellectuals to philosophy, mathematics, and natural sciences gets presented as individual achievement rather than as products of a specific educational approach and philosophical tradition. This separation disconnects intellectual history from the institutional contexts that shaped it. Historical analysis suggests that real power architecture often lies in institutions that quietly educate and guide leaders rather than in visible political structures. The most consequential influence operates through shaping how decision-makers think about problems and solutions, what values they prioritize, and how they understand their roles and responsibilities. This formative power proves more durable than temporary political authority because it operates across generations and institutional boundaries. This missing history prevents public understanding of how influence actually operates across centuries, creating a distorted view of historical causation. We see the surface events, wars, treaties, economic changes, but miss the underlying patterns of ideological formation and network influence that make these events possible. The absence of this dimension from mainstream education means we learn history as a series of disconnected occurrences, rather than as a complex system of interacting forces and influences. Consider what it means when the most consequential power remains unmentioned in official historical records. The silence itself becomes significant evidence, suggesting that successful influence operations avoid drawing attention to their methods and reach. The very absence of discussion about certain networks and relationships indicates where real power might reside, since visible power often attracts scrutiny, while hidden power operates undisturbed. This historical omission itself becomes evidence of successful influence over educational content and historical narrative formation. The ability to shape what gets included and excluded from mainstream historical accounts represents a profound form of power that operates through cultural authority rather than political coercion. The patterns of omission create a collective blindness to certain historical dynamics, ensuring that the architecture of influence remains obscured from public view. Next, let's explore what this means for understanding power in the modern world. What happens when faith-based actors embed themselves in policymaking without formal political power? The modern world has seen the re-emergence of political religion, where religious values inform governance through channels distinct from medieval church-state fusion. This contemporary arrangement operates through think tanks, universities, and NGOs that shape frameworks around climate policy, migration patterns, international development, and human rights discourse. The approach occupies cultural and ideological leadership positions rather than formal political offices, creating influence that flows through intellectual authority rather than legislative power. This method represents a significant departure from historical models, where religious authority directly controlled political structures. Today's influence operates through research institutions that produce policy papers, academic programs that train future leaders, and humanitarian organizations that implement development projects. These channels allow religious values to inform governance without triggering resistance to overt religious intervention, creating more sustainable and widely acceptable forms of influence across different societies and political systems. Historical patterns show this method can steer public opinion and policy across borders without direct authority, by shaping the conceptual frameworks through which problems are defined and solutions are evaluated. These networks influence how governments and international organizations approach complex challenges. The influence operates through accepted expertise and moral persuasion rather than legal mandates or political pressure, making it more flexible and adaptable to different contexts. They orchestrate broader cultural leadership that influences multiple policy domains simultaneously through parallel channels. Climate policy discussions might involve Jesuit-educated scientists and ethicists, while migration debates include input from organizations with Jesuit affiliations, and development strategies reflect principles developed within Jesuit intellectual circles. This comprehensive approach creates coordinated influence across different sectors without requiring centralized control or public coordination. Imagine shaping global norms through multiple soft power channels, rather than single political institutions. The strategy involves influencing how people think about justice, responsibility, and human dignity across educational systems, media platforms, and professional networks. This creates cultural currents that eventually shape political decisions and institutional policies, operating through gradual cultural change rather than immediate political action. In Latin America, this manifests through engagement with land reform and indigenous rights, while in Africa, educational institutions shape new generations of leaders with specific ethical frameworks. Asian contexts show humanitarian organizations influencing political discourse through social engagement rather than direct intervention. Each region experiences this influence through locally appropriate channels, while maintaining connection to broader global networks. Western societies see renewed interest in religious perspectives, not for traditional rituals, but for the moral grounding they offer in complex modern environments. This creates openings for faith-informed perspectives to contribute to debates about technology, economics, and social justice without requiring religious adherence from participants. The approach demonstrates how religious values can inform secular discussions through intellectual contribution rather than doctrinal prescription. This modern political religion doesn't seek to control governments but to influence the minds that control governments. It operates through classrooms where future leaders are formed, conferences where policies are debated, and publications where ideas are circulated. The strategy recognizes that lasting influence comes from shaping how people think rather than what laws they pass, focusing on cultural transformation rather than political victory. The approach represents a sophisticated understanding of power in information-rich societies. Influence increasingly resides in controlling the frameworks through which information is interpreted and the values through which decisions are evaluated. By contributing to these frameworks and values, religious networks maintain relevance despite declining traditional religious participation in many societies. Political religion represents the modern composite instrument of world-making through ideological influence. It demonstrates how organizations can maintain impact by adapting their methods to contemporary conditions while preserving their core purposes. The evolution from direct political control to cultural influence shows strategic flexibility and understanding of how power operates in different historical contexts. Now, let us consider the ultimate question about hidden power in our world and who truly shapes global events when influence operates through these subtle channels. Who truly rules the world when private networks wield influence across education, finance, and religion? The most consequential power may not reside in visible thrones or public treaties, but in the quiet mechanisms that shape how people think and what they value. This power works by cultivating minds, designing curricula, and steering policies from behind the curtain across generations, operating through channels that remain invisible to conventional political analysis. It represents a form of influence that avoids dramatic confrontations in favor of gradual, pervasive transformation of cultural and intellectual landscapes. The Black Pope's authority docenti require public proclamations because the system operates through cultivated loyalties and shared intellectual frameworks rather than commands. This approach creates influence that is both more subtle and more durable than traditional power, functioning through relationships and ideas rather than laws or decrees. The continuity of this system across centuries suggests that certain forms of power can outlast empires, revolutions, and dramatic regime changes, demonstrating remarkable resilience in the face of political turbulence. This framework invites us to reconsider where true power resides in human affairs. We typically look to presidents, parliaments, and international organizations as the centers of decision-making, but these may merely be the visible expressions of deeper currents shaped elsewhere. The real architecture of influence often exists in the networks that educate leaders, finance development, and shape ethical frameworks long before policies reach formal discussion. This perspective challenges conventional narratives about how history unfolds and who directs its course. The quiet cultivation of ideas may prove more durable than military conquest or political revolution. Armies can be defeated and governments overthrown, but the frameworks through which societies understand themselves and their world often persist across these disruptions. Educational systems, research institutions, and cultural traditions continue shaping minds regardless of political changes, creating continuity beneath surface turbulence. This suggests that lasting influence comes from shaping consciousness rather than controlling territory. Consider how much influence exists in the patterns you cannot see in standard historical accounts. The friendships formed in university classrooms, the research priorities set by think tanks, the ethical frameworks developed by scholars. These elements rarely appear in history textbooks, yet they shape decisions about war, economics, and social organization. The absence of these influences from mainstream narratives itself becomes evidence of their successful operation, since the most effective power avoids drawing attention to its methods. This perspective reveals that history is a choreography of influence performed in classrooms and think tanks, rather than a series of dramatic events on battlefields or in legislative chambers. The real direction of human affairs often emerges from quiet discussions among educators. The careful design of academic curricula and the gradual formation of ethical consensus within intellectual communities. These processes create the conceptual frameworks through which societies understand their challenges and opportunities. The ultimate power may reside not in those who make final decisions, but in those who shape how those decisions are conceptualized and evaluated. This represents a shift from traditional notions of authority toward a more sophisticated understanding of how influence operates in complex societies. The ability to define problems and solutions, to establish what counts as legitimate knowledge, and to shape ethical boundaries often proves more consequential than the ability to issue commands or pass laws. This framework helps explain why certain patterns persist across different political systems and historical periods. Despite changes in governments and ideologies, similar approaches to education, economic organization, and international relations continue appearing, suggesting the operation of underlying influences that transcend surface political differences. These continuities point to the enduring power of certain ideas and networks across otherwise divergent contexts. The question of who truly rules invites us to look beyond visible authority figures to the systems that produce and sustain them. It suggests that real power operates through the formation of consciousness rather than the exercise of control, through the shaping of possibilities rather than the elimination of alternatives. This understanding reveals a world where influence flows through multiple channels simultaneously, creating patterns that are both complex and enduring. The most enduring power operates not through visible authority, but through the quiet shaping of minds and institutions across generations. This influence flows through classrooms and networks that cultivate future leaders, long before their decisions affect global affairs. Next time you consider who shapes world events, look beyond thrones and treaties to recognize these subtle channels of formation. The true architecture of history often resides in the shadows where ideas are planted, growing silently until they bear fruit in policy and power, revealing how influence truly moves through our world.